ツアー、今まですごいいいツアーです。で、今日もすごい絶対に面白い話になります。予定はだいたい80分、90分ぐらいトークショーやってからちょっと休憩入って、で残りの時間、多分5、60分ぐらい、ミニライブのチューンがやってもらいます。明日、最後の公演、横浜、タンザって、で、ここで通販販売できないんですけど、明日までチケット持ってない方行きたいんだったら、一応予約してありますので、声かけてください。あと、みんなの席の上にあったと思うんですけど、また CD とかポスター販売できないんですけど、ポスターか最近の CD サインしてほしい、送ってほしい方、記入して、コピーで出してもらってもいいし、後でEメールで送ってもらえば大丈夫です。じゃあ、あと多分2分ぐらい出てきますので、ゆっくりしてください。
こんな、やっぱこういう
僕のテーマ音楽を使ってジョージは怒るかもしれないけど、これでいきましょう。Let me just introduce everybody. For my side of the stage, ヨーマコーコネン。
なんでこのテーマ音楽ちょっと違う
Sorry about that. Okay, that's that for the iPad. We're probably not going to need the rest of the time. じゃあ、前半は4人でちょっと話をしながらちょっと音楽も出てくるかもしれませんけど、後半は2人のコンサートをやっていただきます。もう皆さんお分かりだと思います。いっぱいになりましたよ。よかったな。どうしたい
ね、本当に皆さん聞きたいことあったらね、言ってくださいね。質問たくさんあると思うんで、よろしくお願いします。
皆さんご存知のように、僕はロンドン育ちで、ジョージは日本で生まれて、途中でサンフランシスコで過ごしたり、テキサスで過ごしたり。
正直帰ってきました。もうサンフランシスコに行った時にね、このホットの名前はもうすごいね、名前だったんで、楽しかったですよね、その時代にいたっていうことが。I'll just translate for good translate.
When I spoke to you guys on my show the other day, I mentioned this then. I associated both of you with San Francisco so much because of the Jefferson Airplane, of course.
Sure.
But it turned out you're both from the East Coast.
Correct.
From the Washington area. Being a little bit more precise, where are each of you from?
I'm from Chevy Chase, D.C., which is by the Maryland state line.
Okay.
And,
So that's very close to
it's
Washington.
almost a suburb. Yeah.
Yes.
It's in the Washington area. He was.
I was in Northwest Washington, Davenport area of Washington, D.C. We both lived inside the D.C. area.
We did.
Which was, when you talk about the D.C. area, rarely do people actually live in the 10-mile square that's Washington, D.C., but we did.
Taxation without representation.
Yes, it was a federal 10-mile square area.
ね、彼2人ともワシントン DC なんで、ね、ピーターさんが言ったのね、サンフランシスコだと思ってたら、実はワシントン DC なんですよ、2人とも。このワシントン DC って本当に10マイルかける10マイルぐらいしかないんですけど、で今、ヨーマは冗談で税金を取られるんだけど、選挙にはね、参加できないんですよね。
So, with Hot Tuna, you're still playing, in a way, the music that I presume you almost grew up with, a lot of folk and blues. And I basically want to know where you first came in contact with that music and how.
Well, interestingly enough, I was interested in a lot of music when I was a kid, but obviously not what we call Americana music today. Jack had an older brother that was a year older than me, and I got to know him, and he was a blues collector, and he had all the best of Chess records, best of Muddy Waters, best of Howlin' Wolf, Sonny Boy Blues, and all that stuff, and others also. And so I started listening to that, and I just fell in love specifically with that music.
And this is going back to what, like the late 50s?
That would have been in
56, 7, 8, something like that.
So your brother was actually quite advanced because there probably weren't a lot of white people at that time that were listening to a lot of Chess and Chicago blues, were they?
Well, if you think about the Washington D.C. area, and I think we might have talked about this when we were at your station, Washington's really a southern town. It's not a northern town, and so there is an interesting admixture of all sorts of music, and with a lot of very different people listening to different kinds of music.
We had access also to what within it called the Race Record music stores. One was called Waxy Maxi's Quality Music Store, right next to the Howard Theater. And the Howard Theater was the sister theater to the Apollo. And when I was 14, 15 years old, I'd go down and to listen to all the great acts. But right next to this theater was the record store where you could get these kinds of records. These weren't, Doris Day records or Patti, the pop music at the time. They were records that you didn't hear on the regular radio stations. And you could go through the files, and actually when I started going, they were in 78, and also released on 45. And then pretty soon it was all 45s. But all these titles would come out. I've got Jimmy Reed 45s, and Light and Hopkins 45s, Muddy Waters, and all the Chicago blues stuff. But he also got some of the more rural blues that was available, like Light and Hopkins, and some of the Texas blues that come out, but a lot of the music that come up from New Orleans as well. So we just completely submerged ourselves in that kind of music, because it wasn't like My Doggy in the Window, that was going on the early 50s. And it just put us in a whole other world of music.
Is this post-Elvis or pre-Elvis?
Well, this is actually at the same time. Elvis came on the scene around 56, and I was 12 years old in 1956, so I would have to say it was around that era.
Okay. And were you into all of the rock and roll as well?
Well, rock and roll wasn't called like rock and roll. There was early rock and roll, which mostly was really it came out of the South. That was more like rockabilly, like Gene Vincent was going on, and Carl Perkins that was doing things on some label, and all that was going on at the same time. At the same time, you had all the early rhythm and blues. I got a chance to hear Ray Charles before he had What I Say was out. The early stuff by Ray Charles. A lot of I got to hear Bobby Blue Bland and the blues players there in person at the Howard Theater. And that was really nitty-gritty stuff. At the same time, you'd have Red Fox doing the MC of the show, which was an entertainment all by its own. So all of these records we got to see the artist.
So you guys, in your mid-teens, are getting this sort of direct education in black culture.
Yeah. At the same time, when Yorma went off to college, he's 3 years older. He submerged himself in a Piedmont style, and he'll tell you about that. That opened up alongside the early 60s when the so-called folk revival hit. And you had people like Dave Van Ronk and the Holy Mogul Round was doing music that was kind of rediscovered out of the 30s, 20s, 30s, and 40s. You had some white musicians that were recreating that music.
Right.
But they were rediscovering Mississippi, John Hurst, and Son House, and all that was going on when I was 16 at the beginning of the 60s.
We probably need to get a little translation going here, don't we? ホットチューナーは基本的にフォークとかブルースが今アメリカーナと呼ばれる音楽をやってるわけですけど、2人がね、どこでどのようにそういう音楽と接したかっていう質問だったんですね。要するに50年代の半ば、56年前後になります。ヨーマは40年生まれ、ジャックは43年生まれなんですけど、ジャックはその時12、3なんですね。で、ワシントン DC にはハワード劇場っていう大きなね、いわゆるチットリングサーキットと呼ばれる、のがあるんですけど、黒人の低所得者の人たちが、音楽を聴きに行く会場がもう各大都市にあったんですけど、ワシントン DC にあったのがハワードっていうところ。そこにもしょっちゅうコンサートを聴きに行っていたし、そのコンサート会場のすぐ近くにWaxy Maxy's Quality Music Store、Waxy Maxy's Quality Music Storeっていうレコード屋さんがあって、そこでもいろんなブルーズのレコードが当時まだね78回転の SP 版があったり、同時にちょうど45回転のドーナツ版も出始めの頃なんですけど、そういうところで買ったレコードがもう無数にあるっていうですね。で、シカゴブルーズもそうですし、もうちょっと古い、っていうか古いっていうよりもテキサスのライティング・ホプキンズだとか、そういったもうちょっと渋いブルーズのレコードなんかも聴くことができて、で、ヨーマの方は、もうちょっとすると大学に行くんですけど、そこでアクスティックの、ピーデモントって要するにアメリカの、南東部の、フィンガーピッキングのスタイルが有名な、ブルーズがあるんですけど、それはヨーマの方から説明するという。Let's get on to the Piedmont style then. Where did you go to college, Yoma?
Well, the first college, I went to a number of colleges. I was on the 6-year program. But the first
大
college,
学6年のプログラムだったんで、落第してるって感じです。
the first one I went to was Antioch College in Yellow Springs, Ohio. And Antioch was a really interesting school, and they had a number of folks that were there from New York. Now, in 1959, when I started there, that was sort of like the beginning of what we like to call the Great Folk Scare. There was a lot of people started to get interested in folk music and this and that. And interestingly enough, the centers of some of this music were big cities like New York and also in California too, but I didn't know about that. So I went to Antioch, and I met this guy named Ian Buchanan. He's since passed away. And Ian was not a student of, but was a friend of Reverend Gary Davis, and he had learned a lot of the Reverend stuff, and he took it upon himself to teach me this also. Interestingly enough, Ian's muse was not the Reverend, it was actually Lonnie Johnson. He was more of a jazz guitar player, but that stuff was way over my head at the time.
What was this about the Piedmont style?
Well,
ピーモントスタイルでさっきジャッキー言ったんですけど、それをこのギターでちょっと説明します。
Well, in a nutshell, and I'm not an expert at it because I've sort of gone my own way, but in a nutshell, your right hand sort of becomes like, your thumb is sort of like the left hand of a piano, and your fingers are sort of like the right hand.
親指がピアノの左側で、右側がピアノで、右の指がピアノで。
So.
music on the guitar. That's what drew me to it as well, because it is like two hands on the piano, and where a lot of guitarists will play a lead line or they'll play a rhythm line, but not at the same time. So this way, you have the stride going on like in stride piano,
Right.
with the bass going on, or the octaves and fifths going on down here. It keeps the pulse and the rhythm and the groove going on, and then you add the melody. And that's what makes it so interesting and such difficult to do, because a lot of people don't approach it that way. It takes a lot of work.
And for some reason, this style became really popular in the Carolinas, Georgia, and Florida.
Well, I think that what it is really is each musician, each guitar player is a band unto himself. So, we kind of joke about it. From our point of view, when I teach guitar a lot, and I tell my students, if you learn how to do this and you want to go play somewhere, you don't need to have 6 friends, one of whom owns a band.
True enough. このスタイルだともう一人でもうバンドになるからね、お金のない人がミュージシャンになろうと思ったら、普通5、6人いて1人が車を持ってなきゃいけないと、機材を運ぶためにね、そんなの一切いらないからっていつも言うんですって。
ジャック言ってたのはこれは一人でギターだけなんだけど、ピアノスライドピアノみたいに両手が動いてるからコンプリートのアンサンブルになっちゃうんですよ、一人だけで。それはそのスタイルが特徴ですよね。
So the two of you were already friends by then?
Oh yeah, we like I said, we met. My father was in the service. We were stationed in Pakistan for 4 years, and when I came back to the States in '56 or '55 rather, I met his older brother immediately, and I met Jack, and one thing sort of led to another. We found that we loved the same kind of things, which was a little out of the ordinary for the kids who were at the high school we're at.
And we had a band together in 1958. We had a little high school band together.
Is it the Triumphs?
And the Triumphs, yes. And for a year and a half or so. And we played clubs. We started to play clubs and adventure out into the adult world, so to speak. But I was 15 and he was 17, or 14 and a half, 17.
How did you get to playing clubs that young?
Well, you're going to love this. Not to interrupt you, but this is important. You're going to want to this is a good story. So, in the District of Columbia, in D.C. at that time, you needed to be 18 to go into a bar.
私の DC18 じゃないとバーに入れなかったんですよ。
And we weren't 18.
18じゃなかったからね。
But I worked for my grandfather. My grandfather was a scientist, and he was translating all this stuff from Russian to English. And I would type things out, and he had a copy machine. And so I made a copy of, remember draft cards? You're too young to remember draft cards. Anyway.
Memo draft card?
Yeah.
Draft cards.
Oh, draft.
When you turned 18, you were
Yeah,
already.
Well, anyway, so I borrowed his older brother's draft card, and I put tape over his name, and I put it in the copy machine, and I got a blank draft card back.
父が学者そういうロシア語を翻訳してたんですけど、コピーマシンがあったから兄貴の
1958, a copy machine?
Well, it was actually a photo. It actually wasn't a big camera kind of thing. So we made these things. So anyway, we felt like men, But I've seen pictures of us then,
Yes, and
and we looked like babies.
それカード持ってたから入れたんですけど、実際その時の写真見ると本当まだ子供みたいな顔してるからよくこれで入れたかな。でも兄貴のそのドラフトカードってみんな18歳の時アメリカでは徴兵のためにこれカードもらうんですよね。そのカードをちょっと変えちゃったの。So, did they have pictures on that card?
No.
写真ないんでね。
Driver's license didn't have pictures back then.
そう当時は車の免許も写真なかったからそれ2人とも身分証明書を作ってライブハウスで演奏してました。
One of our early gigs is I believe we were opened up for Link Ray, and Link Ray, started so much with that kind of grindy sound on the guitar, doing rumble and a whole bunch of songs like that, and the seedier clubs in Washington D.C., which was an education all itself.
And just to close the story out, this was my senior year in high school. I moved. My father was in the service, like I said, and he was living in the Philippines. And I came back for my senior year in high school, and I lived with my grandparents. And I'm really sorry, you guys. I'll make it up to you sometime. But anyway, it was tough for them. It wasn't tough for me. And so I tell my grandmother, and she'd say, "Where are you going tonight?" And I said, "We're going to the club." to play. And she had a vision of a country club, like maybe golf. It wasn't a country.
もう父がもうフィリピンにいて おじいちゃんとおばあちゃんも住んだんですって。そこでね、前はどこ行くんですかって言ったら、クラブって言ったらもうカントリークラブでゴルフ場みたいなところだと思ってたんですって、おばあちゃんたちはね。でも実はライブハウス行ってたんですよね。
So, you go to San Francisco first, right?
I did.
Back in those days, what was the image of San Francisco for somebody who had presumably never been there at the time?
Well, at the time that I moved there in '62, this was before the hippie thing. The hippies didn't exist yet. It was the image. My image was a beatnik image. That's what I liked about it.
City Lights bookshop?
Absolutely, yeah, all that stuff, and the coffee gallery and the hot dog palace and all these many. The City Lights is still there, of course, but many of the other places don't exist anymore.
And that fit in well with the folk music scene too. That was all entwined and all of that.
So the folk music scene was entwined with the beatnik scene?
Absolutely, yeah.
Okay, because the image of beatnik somehow seems to be more kind of modern jazz.
Well, there's that too.
Uh-huh.
But that was coming up. Don't forget. No, 1 or 2 years makes a big difference in whether when you're 20 or 21 or 18 to 19 or 20. It seems like major events happen in almost 6-month intervals.
Uh-huh.
So I think maybe the older brothers were sort of beatniks and coming up underneath were the little younger brothers, that went into that folk music scene that then evolved into the hippie scene.
Uh-huh.
Same coffee houses.
Folk music's easier to play than jazz.
Yep. Yeah. So what brought you to San Francisco in the first place?
Well, I went to San Francisco to go to school. Once again, in a nutshell, I went to Antioch College, and then I went to the Ateneo de Manila in the Philippines for 2 years, and that's a Jesuit school. And when I came back to the United States, I had all these credits in Thomistic philosophy and epistemology and this and that nothing but another Jesuit school would take. So I wanted to go to the University of San Francisco, but my grades weren't good enough. So I went to the University of Santa Clara.
Okay. 最初オハイオ州のアンティオクっていう大学に行ってたんだけど、その後お父さんの仕事の関係でしばらくフィリピンにいた。そこでカトリック系の学校にいていろんなコースを取っていたんですけど、アメリカに戻ってくるとね、いわゆるクレジットがあるんですね。でそのクレジットを重ねるために同じカトリック系の学校じゃなきゃいけない。でUSF ってサンフランシスコ大学っていうのもカトリック系なんですけど、そこに入るためには成績が足んなかったから、もうちょっと郊外のサンタクララっていうか、Is that a Jesuit school as well? Santa Clara?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah, absolutely.
South of San Francisco.
Yes, yes. But USF is also a Jesuit school, isn't it?
Pardon?
USF is also a Jesuit school.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. いや、サンタクララってもうちょっとサンフランシスコより南にある神戸とても綺麗なところですけど、そこの大学に結局入ったと。Okay, so you went there as a student.
I went there as a student, and that really changed my life in a lot of ways, because the first week that I was there, I remember we talked a little bit backstage before. The San Francisco in the area was a very small town. That the tallest building was only 8 stories tall. Everything was very, very small. So anyway, so I'm in this little town 50 miles south, and I see a sign on a telephone pole. The sign said that there was a hootenanny, which is like a folk jam session. Well, I'm going to go. It was my first weekend. I went there, and that weekend I met Janis Joplin and Jerry Garcia and a lot of people that went on to become
Santa Clara? Was it down in South and Santa Clara?
Yeah.
The hootenanny was in Santa Clara.
Yeah, the hootenanny was in Santa Clara.
Okay. で着いた週に同じサンタクララでフーテナニーって要するにフォークのジャムセッションみたいなもので、これがあってもう自分がすでにフォークミュージックに興味を持っているから、これは行かなきゃって言って、その日にジャニス・ジョプリンとジェリー・ガーシアに会ったと。Okay, nobody knew who they were, of course. Back in those days.
No, we were just.
Was Jerry playing banjo?
He was playing guitar the night that I saw him there, but he had this was before the jug band. He had the Black Mountain Boys, a bluegrass band.
Was Jack there yet or not?
No.
Not yet.
So yeah, you moved from the East Coast to San Francisco.
From Washington D.C.
Yeah.
But we had well, Yorma went off to college. I finished out high school, and then I did a lot of work in the club work. I'm talking 6 nights a week, 5 sets a night.
Wow.
In a lot of the cover bands where you wore plaid tuxedos, and every band had 3 saxes in it. You did a lot of cover work of songs. But while I was in college, I studied a lot of folk music, a lot of English and Irish ballads and the child ballads, and I did a thesis on that. But I also was going to all the folk music revival clubs and whatnot that was coming out of that very jazz scene that was involved with music. So a lot of those clubs that were jazz clubs just a couple of years before started having folk music in many of the same clubs. Maybe they changed the name, sometimes they wouldn't. At the same time, I was kind of working. I started playing bass in 1960, as well as guitar, and I worked some gigs as a guitarist and some gigs as a bass player. And then I think we were having a phone call with Bob Linder, which was a mutual friend of ours, who was a bluegrass banjoist. And Yorma had moved out to the West Coast. And in any case, the upshot of the conversation was, this is in the summer of 1965. I was going to college because then everybody had to go to college, or you were in the Army in Vietnam.
Right. So you were in college when?
I was in Montgomery Junior College in Montgomery Park, Maryland.
Okay.
And so I'm 21 years old. I turned 21 in April. And there was a conversation, and I said, "What are you doing?" He said, "Well, you won't believe this, but I've just joined a folk rock band." And I laughed, and I said, "You, the purist? You got to be kidding me!" And he said in July he had formed with Marty Bellin and Paul Cantor the Jefferson Airplane. I said, "What's the name of the band?" And he said, "Jefferson Airplane." And I laughed. I said, "What kind of name is that?" So he said that he wasn't really happy with the bass player, but first of all, he found out I played bass. He said, "What are you doing?" I said, "I'm doing the usual stuff. I'm working clubs every night and going to school. I'm playing bass." And he said, "Oh, you're playing bass?" I said, "Yeah." So he said, "I'll call you back." And he called back and he says, "Listen, I'd like you to come out to San Francisco and join this band. I need an ally in the band, you know." And so I said, "You're on." And this was in the summer. Or actually, this was in September, and I just started the school year, so I dropped out and went out in October of 1965. And a few days later, we did our rehearsal. We did our first show at Harmon Gymnasium on October 16th, 1965.
You remember the day?
I do.
To this day?
Well, I've told the story so many times.
Oh, okay.
And the bass he played, he borrowed from the bass player he was replacing.
Oh,
Right. Yeah, I had done a job not too long before that where I got my bass stolen. And you'll love this. I was backing up Little Anthony and the Imperials for a 2-week gig, and I had my Bonneville motorcycle and it was, you leave all your equipment at the gig for 2 weeks, and Little Anthony would come in with his musical arranger in a shark skin suit and the whole deal. And I was playing with one of James Brown's drummers at the time, and he got me this gig. And this, the long and the short of it is, one of the times that I came back to the gig, my bass was gone. So I basically had no bass when I came out to San Francisco. I borrowed another gentleman's bass, Bob Harvey's bass.
Perfect. That's just perfect.
And played the gig and got the gig. And then I went down to Satterley and Chapin and bought a new 1965 jazz bass. Okay, tell that.
Well, when we start now. ジャックは大学生だったんですね。で、最初はギターで、途中から1960年からベースをやり始めたんですけど、典型的なカバーバンドで、1週間に6日間、毎晩5回演奏しなきゃいけないような、そういうバンドでずっとやってたんですけど、ヨーマから電話かかってきて、新しく、フォークロックのバンドに入ったんだって言って、でそれまでのヨーマとはもう純粋なもうフォーク主義者っていうのかな、 その彼がフォークロックやること自体が信じられなくて笑っちゃったんですって。それでそのバンドの名前はって聞いたらジェファソン・エアプレイって言われて、これまたなんていう名前ですかっていうことになったんですけど、その最初のベースプレーヤーはあんまりうまくいってなくて代わりの人が欲しい。でもジャックと話したその時にはまだ彼がベースやってるってことを知らなくて、最近ベースやってるって言ったら、あ、そう、じゃあちょっと待って、また連絡するからって言ってしばらくしてもう一度電話かかってきて、それでぜひこのバンドに俺も自分の味方が欲しいからということで、サンフランシスコに行ってオーディションを受けたんだけど、その前は、リトル・アントニー&エンピリアルズっていうドゥーワップのグループがありますよね。そのバンドのツアーを2週間やってて、その2週間の間にどこかで誰かが彼のベースを盗んじゃったんですって。でベースがなくてサンフランシスコ行った時は楽器もないのに、オーディションやらなきゃいけない。で自分が、要するにその前のベーシストの楽器を借りてやって、そしてその人の代わりになるっていうからちょっと罰の悪い話なんですけど、そういういきさつがありました。で、大学生的な
大学行ってた理由っていうのは、当時のアメリカは大学行ってないので徴兵されちゃったんですよ。大学行ってれば if you're in school you had no drafts, you didn't have to. それで大学行ってたんですって。大学行って辞めちゃったらもうすぐもう徴兵されちゃうんですよ。
So we're in San Francisco, it's 1965. For people like me being in London, 1967, Summer of Love, all this, you get it all suddenly. None of us knew at the time that this had all been going on for many, many years. I've read subsequently that 65 was probably the height of the real hippie thing. Is that right?
That's a good question. I guess it would depend on who you're talking to. But I would have to say, really, that the hippie thing really changed a lot. I think in some respects it could have been maybe 67. But the thing is that in the mid-60s, 65, the hippie thing, tie-dye didn't exist. Tie-dye is an industry now. Tie-dye didn't, none of that stuff existed. The clothing styles tended to be very period, like Old Western or Edwardian, and lots of secondhand clothing stores, lots of artists, lots of arts and crafts industries and stuff like that. And later on, especially when people started coming from the rest of the United States to San Francisco, in many respects, it was over.
Right. ヒッピーというと67年のサマー・オブ・ラブというもう有名な、イメージがあるんですけれど、実はもうその頃にもう終わってたんじゃないかということをよく言われるんですね。まあそのことを今聞いたんですけど、今ヒッピーというとみんなすぐタイダイ連想するものですけど、あれはまあ一つの産業になってしまって、当時はそういうのじゃなくてみんなもっとお下の古着とか、あるいはもう昔の100年ぐらい前のファッションが流行ってたりとか、みんなそれぞれの格好があった。でももっと自由な時代だったっていうことですね。
In 67, when this whole thing, everybody started coming from all over, was that when there were the most concerts? Was that like we hear about, there was music everywhere in those days?
Well, we talked a little bit about this backstage. Before things started, I mean, before the rock scene and the psychedelic scene got started in San Francisco, you needed a special license to play music for dancing. And so these dance concert things that we just joked about, they had to be like instructional, I mean, really odd stuff, you know, I mean, you can't, the laws don't make any sense. But the San Francisco scene, in my opinion, really started in Nevada City at the Red Dog Saloon, and if you haven't seen the movie Rockin' at the Red Dog, you really need to see that, because the Charlatans were really one of the first so-called hippie bands before anybody. The Jefferson Airplane, by comparison, we were incredibly conservative, you know. We wore suits when we played and stuff like that. I mean, the Charlatans dressed up like outlaws, you know. They all carried guns. They did.
Dan Hicks in the group at that time?
Pardon?
Was Dan Hicks in the group?
The
Oh, absolutely, yeah,
drummer.
sure. He was the drummer of the band, yeah.
彼に一番ね、その60何年で一番盛り上がってたかって聞いたんですけど、実はサンフランシスコのシーンって言ってヒッピーのシーンのこと言うんですけど、実はネバダっていう隣の州の小さい山の中にある金山を掘ってる町だった。What is it? Silver mine or gold mine?
Silver.
そう銀山のちっちゃい町が山の中にあって、そこにレッドドッグサルーンっていう飲み屋があって、そこでシャーロットンズっていうバンドが、ライブやってたんですよ。そこが最初のそういうサイケデリックのバンドじゃないかってから言うんですよね。なぜかというと、ジェファーソンはまだそう保守的でスーツ着てたんですって。でもシャーロットンズはもうみんな西部劇の格好してピストルなんかもうつけてたんですって。本当にもうその世界に入り込んでて、ジェファーソンエアプレイはそいつらと比べると保守的なバンドだったね。
You know, there's a great story also. You need to see the movie. It's fantastic. But apparently the sheriff of Nevada City walked into the saloon, and you're supposed to check your guns. And so he went to the bartender. He said, "I'd like to check this gun." The bartender took it, shot a hole through the ceiling, and said, "It works great."
これネバダシティっていうとこ本当西部劇に出てきそうな街なんですけど、ちっちゃいね。そして保安官がその店に入ってきて、このチェック・ユー・ガンっていうのは昔は西部の街っていうのはピストル持ってたら簡単に預けなくちゃいけないんですよ。人を撃たないように。それでそういうふうにやって保安官が来てガンをチェックしたいって言ったら、その人とかバーテンがそのガンを取って撃って「あ、これ大丈夫だよね、これガン」チェックってそういう意味もあるんですけど、調べるってことでね。だからそれ撃っちゃったんだってね。それがそういう世界だったんですよ。
It's an American thing.
So American, check your guns.
Yeah,
I'm trying to translate check your guns.
Yeah, exactly. Good luck on that.
Back in the mid-60s, the West Coast wasn't yet a center for music, commercially speaking. Not even LA.
Los Angeles was, definitely.
Really? I mean, they had
absolutely.
Capitol there from the 40s. There were a lot of independent labels, but I mean,
the major labels were Los Angeles, Capitol Records, RCA, all of those, the Wrecking Crew, all of those
I guess those
records,
Yeah,
the Wall of Sound, all of that kind of stuff. All those commercial records came out of there. That Philadelphia, New York, and Nashville were the real
Right.
big centers.
but it was still very much.
But there was nothing going on in San Francisco.
Well, exactly. Yeah, that's what I was going to get to. And it's interesting that there were so many great bands in San Francisco where there wasn't. I mean, there are a couple of recording studios, I guess, but.
Well, in the beginning there were none. But
Really?
ultimately, I think when the ball got rolling, and people go where they follow the money, and the record companies and some independent people realize we need to have studios up there.
Don't forget the real revolution in the music business was that bands would form as equal members and get a record contract. And before it would always been a ruthless business, a leader and sideman, and you changed. A lot of times you did your record with the professionals in Los Angeles, like the Wrecking Crew, and you went and hired a band out with a lead singer or whoever had the hit record. And they were produced and manufactured, and I mean, it was like a 10-pound alley of Los Angeles. What was different in San Francisco was the bands the musicians formed together from many different backgrounds. There's an example of the Jefferson Airplane. You had Norman, who was probably the purest of the genre of blues and folk music, playing it on with fingerstyle on the acoustic guitar, who had to really learn how to play electric guitar with a band, and eventually melded those two styles together. But then you had me that probably had the most experience playing in bands professionally and club work coming out from DC. You had Paul Kantner that was from probably his influences were more like the Weavers and vocal harmonies and whatnot, that genre of folk music. You had Marty Ballin that was a professional produced singer in the early 60s that had released individual solo pieces, to be put out there as pop records. And Signe Anderson was the first girl singer with it from the folk background, later on Grace Slick. So you had these people coming together, but they would form as a band, and they would stick together as a band, and they'd make it as a band or not make it as a band. And what was different is that band would eventually get its fan base, that would follow the band as it went through its growth spurts and discovered different ways to play and different things to do. And that happened with the Grateful Dead, with the Warlocks before that. All those guys came from drastically different backgrounds. They're Charlatans, Quicksilver Messenger Service, and Janis Joplin with Big Brother and the Holding Company. Big Brother and the Holding Company was a band that was intact, and then Janis joined that band. So the difference was, the real difference was, that those bands got signed to record contracts. When we held out for our record contract, we all went down there, we all signed as a band, everybody's name was on the contract, and that had never been done before.
音楽業界の仕組みの話をちょっとしてました。ロサンゼルスは、ニューヨークほどではないにしてもかなり活発なシーンになってて、キャピトルレコードもあって RCA の会社もあったり、大きい会社の支社もいくつかありました。それで例えばフィル・スペクターがいつも使っていたレキンクルーと呼ばれる人たち、そういうバックミュージシャンの優れた一流の人たちもたくさんいて、LA のやり方っていうのはどちらかというとソロ歌手がいて、その下にバンドがつくっていう形になってて、契約の仕方もそのソロの歌手だけが契約にサインする。でサンフランシスコで何が変わったかというと、バンドが一つのユニットになったわけですね。一人じゃなくてバンドのメンバー全員みんなそれぞれバックグラウンドがバラバラだったりするけれど、そのレコード会社との契約をするときに全員がサインするわけだから、その意識が違うんですね。みんなが一緒にやっているっていう意識を持ちます。ジェファソン・エアプレイの場合は今ジャックが説明したんですが、ヨーマンは一番フォークよりでフォークとかブルーズをずっとギターで弾いてて、そのバックグラウンドがありました。でジャックの方はバンドのメンバーとしていろんなそういうライブの活動を長年積んでいた。でポール・キャントナーっていう人はむしろフォークっぽいウィーバーズっていうのを引き合い出してましたけど、ああいうハーモニーのフォークグループのようなことをやってて、でマーティ・バレーっていうもう一人のボーカリストはポップシンガーとしてやってて、60年代の初頭からソロでシングル出したり割とポップなイメージでやってました。でもう一人一番最初1枚だけ参加してたシグニー・アンダーソンっていう女性はフォークの世界から出てきた人で、その後にすぐにグレス・スリックが変わりますけれど、とにかくみんなバックグラウンドがバラバラだったけれど、ジェファソン・エアプレインとして一緒になると、一つのバンドになる。で同じくグレートフル・デッドにしても、あるいはクイックシルバー・メッセンジャー・サービスにしても、ジャニス・ジョプリンが後から加わったビッグブラザー&ホールデンカンパニーにしても、シャーラタンズにしてもみんなバンドなんですね。でサンフランシスコを決定的に違ってたのはそこだって。
Were you guys one of the first ones to get signed?
We were the first one to get signed.
I came out and the band formed in July. I came out in October, and I think we signed in early 1966, and soon after made our first album.
最初に時代のバンドでサイン契約したので、彼ら出てきてもHow long after you came out? 6 months?
Yeah.
半年後にはもうバンドとして契約できたんですって。最初の時代のバンドなんて契約できたからね。
You can't make this stuff up. We got so lucky.
ラッキーだった。それはつける回しできないけど、すごいラッキーだった。What was the hook that got you guys the contract? Was it your live gigs? Or?
Well, Marty Ballin had an interest in a club called the Matrix, and that really gave us a format and an area to flesh out material and keep turning material. And every couple of months, maybe every month, we played four nights in a row, 6 nights in a row, something like that. We got to build our audience up, but also we got to turn material over, I think, more rapidly than we would have normally.
And we rehearsed relentlessly.
Yes.
We did something that none of us as older people would ever do. We just rehearsed for 6-7 hours a day.
And I would have to say the unique sound of the Airplane at that time was the vocal harmonies, and where a lot of bands maybe had one strong singer, but they didn't do a lot of harmony. And Paul really liked the harmonies, and that made a unique sound. A 3-part harmony force coming out after it was a big sound.
But as you said, all of you coming from very different musical backgrounds. Was it easy to make a kind of cohesive band?
Well, I always like to say that it was like getting on stage with 5 ex-wives.
みんなバラバラのバックグラウンドですからね、こう統一したバンドサウンドを作るのは大変じゃなかったかって聞いたら、いつもね、5人の元妻と一緒にステージに上がるようなもんだった。
で彼らも契約でいくつか理由があったんですけど、一つはメンバーのマーティー・バレンがメイトリックスというライブハウスの関係者だったんで、彼らはそこで毎晩ライブできたんですよ。だから週に4日ライブやったり、そういう場所があるからお客さんもどんどん増やせて、自分たちで書いて曲も演奏して変えていけたんですよ。でもう一つはやっぱりポールがハーモニー好きだったんで、当時はそういうハーモニーのバンドっていなかったんですよね。でもこのバンドはマーティやポールとその女の人のシンガーがハーモニーできたから、それでももうちょっと別だったんですよね。それでジョーマン言うには他の人よりもうすっごい大人としては絶対もうできないぐらいに毎日練習してたんですって。リハーサルを6時間毎日やってるんです。6 hours a day rehearsal.
And there wasn't a lot of luck involved. I think the chemistry of any group of people, like in a what's called football or soccer team, is that certain group of people that make a sound that totally is different. And we had a unique sound. When I listen back onto the records now, the very first record, right away, you could tell everybody was staking out their territory. There wasn't any weak links in it. Everybody had a strong sound unto themselves.
だからラッキーだけじゃなくてね、バンドってメンバーが一緒に来て、一人ずつがすごいユニークなものを持ってたから、それが集まって本当他の人が持ってない、他のバンドが持ってない音を作れたんですって。だからそれがすごい自信持ってたもんなんですよね。一人ずつがもうユニークも持って、今でも昔のレコードで聞くと、みんな一人ずつが力強く演奏してるメンバーになってるっていうのが大切だったんです。
What's really interesting about that period is that a lot of yourselves, plus people like the Grateful Dead or the other bands, there was a lot of really strange songs on those albums, and all of us took that in our stride, and we all enjoyed it as kids. You think if anybody tried to do that music now, what would happen?
That's a good question. I guess nobody's really doing that music now, so it's hard to say. But I think what happened was, in some respects, I mean, me and Jack and the rest of the Jefferson Airplane, we were in the music business. We were a professional band, but we didn't sound like all the other bands. We didn't sound like Paul Revere and the Raiders or whatever. The mainstream rock things up to that point. And because of the talent that was involved in the Dead, in all the San Francisco bands you mentioned, we were almost sort of like anti-heroes in some respects about that. And I don't think it was done on purpose. That's just the way we thought. And because we had gained some sort of popularity, which meant that we were making money, which changes a lot of minds, it wasn't that they allowed us to do it. There was nothing else we could have done. And the good news is that, bless you, people like you listen to us.
Actually, when you said anti-heroes, now it just kind of got me thinking. This is a time when, in movies as well, the anti-hero was starting to become popular. I mean, things like Bonnie and Clyde came along right around that time.
Yeah. Vanishing Point, remember Vanishing Point? Yeah.
一種のアンチヒーローのようなイメージになったか。
アンチヒーローってアンチヒーローって日本語でなんて言うんだろうね。
アンチヒーローでいい。
アンチヒーローって大丈夫ですか？
Now I was trying to think. What did I ask you that you were answering that question? Oh, I know. あの時代の音楽ってね、変な曲がいっぱいあるんですよ。で、普通に大きいレコード会社と契約してて、レコード売れてるんです。60年代後半っていうのは。で、今の時代にあんなことやろうとしたら、多分まず契約もできないと思うんですね。だから自分たちとしてもね、一種のアンチヒーロー的な意識があって、別にそれをやろうとしてたわけじゃなくて、もうそれ以外に何もできないというものだったけど、まあそういう時代だったっていう。
Quite an interesting scene, the whole town of anti-heroes.
And you had this incredible live scene. I mean, this the Fillmore, and then before that there's the Family Dog, I guess. And there's this whole scene of people standing up to watch gigs, or dancing, I guess. Was this something that existed elsewhere, or was this very much a San Francisco thing?
I think that it was really a San Francisco thing. And the other thing also that was interesting in that time was that people would listen to these somewhat eccentric songs that we wrote, but not only just us. I mean, you know, you've looked at some of the bills that Bill Graham had at the Fillmore. You could have Yevtushenko, you know, Russian poet, and one of the guy from Lawrence Ferlinghetti would read the translations. Charles Lloyd, a jazz quintet, Jefferson Airplane. I mean, you have these incredibly disparate evenings, and everybody would listen to everything.
You know, Bill Graham was a master at that, and he loved putting different kinds of aesthetic elements of in the world of art together on the same stage. And so he would educate his audiences. You know, that audience would be there hearing a poet, but maybe they came to hear a band. And
Yeah, but the audience would tolerate that. No audience today would tolerate that.
well, you know, one of the other things that happened that helped feed all of this was the audience wasn't looked down upon by the band. The audience was part of the whole scene. And as soon as you finished playing, you were in the audience listening to another band. Arm and I would go out and hear bands all the time because we weren't working constantly. There was a lot of downtime where you would go and hear other musicians, other poets, anything going on at the time. So you were aware that you were, as soon as your set was over, you were part of the audience as well. And that was different. It was the audience was part of you, and you fed off of that. And I think that created expectations for the audience as they watched you change your style and watched you try different things. And you tried really hard in the live music to go somewhere else with a song. Rarely were the songs played the way they were played as you recorded them. You'd hear the tempos change, everything changed a year later in the way you play that song. And we were young in developing our sounds on our instruments. And as you discovered something new, you played it. You know, if you got on a new track or something like that, some new area of your instrument that you were exploring, you know, you worked on it. You know, and the audience knew that.
でサンフランシスコの独自のライブシーンについて聞いたんですけど、それまではね、コンサートっていうと普通は座席に座って聴くものだったけれど、60年代のサンフランシスコの一番大きな特徴の一つはお客さんは座ってないですね。立って踊ったりしながら聴いている。でそれが独特だったかっていうと確かにそうだ。で特にビル・グレアムの場合は一晩のコンサートで例えばロシア人の詩人が朗読していて、サンフランシスコのローレンス・ファリンゲティという有名な人がそれを聞いて英訳をしてやってたり、それで例えばチャールズ・ロイドのジャズのグループがいて、でジェファソン・エアプレインがいてというそれぞれ全然違う音楽あるいは詩の朗読なんかもあるんだけれど、ビル・グレアムはあえてお客さんに対してこれだけいろんなものを聞いてくださいよって言ってみんなも積極的にそれを聞く。今の時代だったらそういうふうに人を集めることはおそらく無理だっただろうという話で
ブーイングされちゃうよね。
もう多分ね。
グロッキーやね。
それとバンドのメンバーはねお客さんより自分が偉いと全然思ってない。ものすごく連帯感があって自分の演奏が終わったら今度は自分が客席に降りて別のバンドを聴いてるからみんなミュージシャンでやると同時に聴き手でもある。それがすごく独特だったっていうんですね。いつも毎日仕事があるとは限らないし、仕事のない時は自分がいろんなところに出かけていろんな音楽を聴く、そういう非常にクリエイティブな時代だったんですね。
What happened with the outdoor festivals? We think of San Francisco, we think of Golden Gate Park concerts. Was that as prevalent as we come to believe?
Yes. Yeah, there was a lot of that. That was one of the interesting things that definitely emanated from the Bay Area was the free concerts in the parks. There were lots and lots of them.
ベイエリア、サンフランシスコのベイエリアの場合ね、本当公園でね、フリーコンサートよくやってたんですよ。だからライブ会場行かなくても公園でね、昼間からやってるから、すごいたくさんあったんですって。And you guys played it, of course, you guys all over the place, man.
A lot of them. I mean, they started out just being where you could set up. I remember we did one out at Mirror Beach. It was freezing cold, with the fog coming in. And a little stage was set up, and then in the Panhandle leading into Golden Gate Park around 1966, we started setting up on flatbed trucks. And the equipment was small, and the PA system sounded like this. But we just set up shop and try to get permits when we could. Sometimes we didn't have permits, and you were shut down until you got, it was part of that sort of rebel thing going on, of bringing music to the people, so to speak, in spite of the civil
demand.
The laws of the town that you have to have a permit for everything.
ライブできるところね、もうどんどん増やそうと思ってて、例えば今言ってたのミュアビーチっていうところでやったんですね。ミュアビーチってサンフランシスコから北行ったところなんですけど、すごい霧がかかってきて、もうちっちゃいステージで寒くて、very cold beach, Mirror Beach そういうところでもやったり、あとゴールデンゲートパークのパンハンドルっていうことで出っ張ってるところなんですけど、公園のそこではもう許可あったりなかったりない時ではトラックの後ろにバンドを乗せてそこで行って演奏したんですって。当時はもうそういう PA のことなんかあんまりなくて、さっき言ったcould you do the PA voice again? The PA voice like this, attention こんな感じだったんですけど、でやるところはね増やすためにね、そういうなんかもうちょっとね若者の遊びみたいな感じですよね。
Hot Tuna starts 1969.
Yeah.
What brought on the birth of Hot Tuna?
Well, in the beginning when we were touring with the airplane, we weren't making very much money, so when we weren't sleeping on somebody's couch, we shared hotel rooms. And in those days, hotel rooms didn't have TV sets. So it's hard to imagine, I know, it's hard to imagine. But anyway, and the gigs weren't very long back then either, we were on these shows, we'd be back in the hotel by 10 o'clock maybe. It was a different time. And Jack and I would share the room, and we'd sit around, and we had nothing to do, and I'd always have my acoustic guitar, and we started playing together, seriously, the music that became the first Hot Tuna album.
ホットチューナはどうやって生まれたかっていう聞いたんですけど、当時コンサートそんなに長くなくて、大体もう10時ぐらいにはねホテルの部屋に入る。でお金がないからね、誰かのソファに寝させてもらうということもあったんだけど、ホテル泊まるにしても大体ね部屋をシェアします。で当時のホテルにはね、信じられないかもしれないけど、まだホテルが部屋にない時代だったからすることがない。でいつもアコースティックギターを持ってたから、ジャックといつも暮らしてたから、2人でそういう、結局ホットチューナーのスタイルになる音楽をやってるうちに、2人のそういうのができてきた。And was there a need to do something apart from what the airplane was doing?
Well, I think the music fit into a different category.
Right.
The music didn't really fit into the airplane world, so to speak, but we also had a love of this music. But what happened was, as we explained before, Jorma could play a complete song himself, by himself. But when I added the bass to it, and we worked playing the bass within that configuration, that freed me up to move up into perhaps the cello range for hinting at part of the melodies that he'd be playing on the guitar. Because when I would go up in the other range, that thumb would keep the groove going together and keep the low end. He also would play moving bass lines on the guitar. So your ear, it wasn't a big dropout with the bass not sitting down in the pocket playing the rhythm section all the time. So we kind of developed a very close personal acoustic bass sound that turned out to be quite different. Nobody had done that kind of thing before, particularly with that kind of music. Then Jorma started to really develop his songwriting, and as the original songs became folded into the material that we did, we really found ourselves with new territory to experiment with the sonic qualities of those two instruments and see how they'd work out. And we discovered a lot of new music. It was just plain fun to play as well. And since in our career of 50-some years, we've never had a band meeting. Therefore, we have never really had a fight. And so we just have mutual love of playing. And when the politics with one band, yeah, exactly, would get so prevalent, and the politics of the time, the Vietnam War and all of this stuff going on and the protests, that became so overwhelming that all of a sudden the purity of the music, in my opinion, started to dilute out towards the 70s, the beginning of the 70s. We found ourselves more than ever attracted back into the music world of what we were doing. And then we started playing shows. We started opening up shows to the Jefferson Airplane, early on, and doing a full set before we did our Jefferson Airplane set. And we kind of like we had a built-in audience, so to speak. We were at least able to present this material out to an audience that probably wouldn't have had access to that material without that airplane format to begin with. But that set us up, I think, to go out and strike out on our own and see where we could develop.
Did Hot Tuna get paid twice for being Hot Tuna and then being
Did we get paid
No.
twice? That's a good
No.
Yeah. No.
They got us for free.
Yeah, but we got the audience, so we made it okay.
例えばジェフズエアプレイン前座で出たんですけど、ギャラはエアプレインでしか出なかったんですけど、でも一応エアプレインで客がいるからその客だけをいただきました。
その2人でやってることはやっぱりエアプレインのサウンドとは全然違うものだからうまくその中には溶け込まないわけですね。で、ヨーマはヨーマでさっきの話がフィンガーピッキングのスタイルっていうのは親指でベースを押さえて指でピアノの右手の部分をやってるわけですね。だから一人でもう完全に曲を演奏できるから。でもね、ジャックがベースで加わるとまた新たな側面がこう開けてくる。でも親指でベースを押さえてるからベースはねただリズムに徹する必要は全然なくて、でベースのもっと高いチェロに近い、音域も使えるし、でまたヨーマが歌ってるメロディーが示唆する音もベースで弾いたりとか、いろんなねそういう新たな、展開が可能になってくるわけなんですね。で
So pretty soon we have questions and answers.
Oh, okay, all right. Hang on, I was halfway through that. What else did I miss?
You got the cello.
Yeah, I got that.
You got the
Oh yeah. それで最初はもう古いフォークとかブルースの曲だけだったけど、今度ヨーマがいろんな曲を作るようにもなるからね、さらにねいろんな、ハーモニーだとかそういったさらに新しい、可能性が出てくる。で、エアプレインの前座をやってたんですね。そうでなければおそらくああいう音楽をエアプレインのファンに聴いてもらうことはできなかったんだろうけど、自分たちもメンバーだからそれでオーディエンスができたわけです。でそうこうしてるうちに自分たちの別のコンサートができるようになったっていう、そういう経緯です。
No fights, no fights.
そうでメンバーが多ければ多いほどいろんな喧嘩が起こりうるものなんですけど、2人は一度もバンドミーティングというものをやったことないし、とにかくお互いに演奏するのが大好きだから、今まで喧嘩という喧嘩はしたことない。50年以上ずっと一緒にやってる。
バンドミーティングがないからね。No band meetings.
No band meetings.
Airplane, the airplane getting into fights?
Oh my God.
We used to fight over one chord for hours. Would we play a D chord or would we play a G chord? It's like your stomach would go. You could go out on the street for a while, walk around, come back in.
Breathe.
エアプレインってもすごいもう細かいことでもね、コードの名前だけでどっちに弾くかっていうのでも喧嘩になってもう出て散歩行かないともうできなくなっちゃったんですって、もうお腹痛くなっちゃったりね。もうでもAirplane was like that. That's was kind of good for Hot Tuna then.
Well, that was part of the strength of the airplane was that everybody did have a fully developed personality. So we say, and when it would come together, when it would work, it would really be something unique. I think as the airplane grew, we all grew as musicians and singers. by the time 1970 hit, everybody had started to kind of, there was, the format wasn't working anymore because you wanted to work on what you were, the next thing was for you. The next thing for Yorm and I was pretty much Hot Tuna.
やっぱりその時もそういう仲悪くなってたし、そして自分たちはもうやりたいことがだんだんみんなメンバー変わってきたんですよ、70年代で。ヨーロマとジャックは一番やりたいことはホットツナみたいなのをやりたかったから、方向がどんどん変わっちゃって、70年代からホットツナの方にやっぱりフォーカスするようになったんです。で、やっぱりね、全員すごいパーソナリティって言ってましたけど、すごいいろんなすごい強い性格なんですよ、みんなね。だからそういろんな喧嘩なんかあったんですけど、この2人はそれないみたいです。
Okay, let's open it up to questions then, shall we?
Could I get one more question?
Oh, yeah, go ahead.
How did you get Papa John Creech in here, man? What was the deal with him? He seems so much older than they are.
Well, here's
But now we're much older
Than
than
he was. Papa John Creech っていたんですよね。
Marty and Joey Covington, who played drums with for a while, met him at a club on La Brea, I think called the Paris Club. And I don't know, maybe Jack knows more about this. In any case, they met him and they heard him play and they brought him around. And I remember the first time I met him was at Winterland. We're doing a show at Winterland, and they just brought him up and said, "This is Papa John Creech." And we said, "You bring your violin?" He said, "Yeah." I said, "Let's play." And then he was in the band.
メンバーが何人かはラブレークラブで、What was the club called? Paris Club?
Paris Club.
Paris Club で彼がパパ・ジョン・クリーチ演奏してるのを見て、これある日ウィンターランドのライブの時に連れてきちゃって、バイオリン持ってるかって言ったら、
多分ね、知らない人もいると思うんですよ。パパ・ジョン・クリーチっていうのは、ね、黒人のおじいさんのバイオリン奏者なんです。
そうだね。これその人の飛び入りでそこから聴き始めて、それメンバーになっちゃったんですけど、でも彼ら言うには当時の彼もうすごいおじいちゃんだったんですけど、僕たちの方が年だって。
He was such an interesting guy, and I mean, here's a guy. I remember there's a thing on YouTube. Thank God for YouTube. Of him playing in the Nat King Cole trio. It's in a movie. It's just the clip is just of him playing, and they're like a dining car at a train or something like that. There's the Nat King Cole trio, and one of the trio is Papa John.
パパ・ジョンってもう本当知らない人いると思うんですけども、つるっぱげでおじいちゃんの黒人のねバイオリンプレイヤーで、その YouTube で見ると調べるとナッキンコールトリオでバイオリン弾いてるのパパ・ジョン・クリーチ出てるんです。I gotta see that. YouTube 素晴らしいですね。
I mean, I think when he was playing with us, he was in his mid-50s, but I wasn't quite sure. He wouldn't really say. But I remember we were thinking he was ancient, you know. We were thinking like, gee, he could still play. He's in his mid-50s.
I wish I was 50 again.
パパ・ジョン・クリーチが来てた時でも絶対年を言ってくれなかったんですけど、もう50代でこんなおじいちゃんがまだ演奏できるのかなと思ってたら、自分たちねもうとっくに過ぎちゃってますよね。We thought the same thing when we bought those records.
質問ある方どうぞ。はい。
エレクトリックセットの時とアクスティックセットの時がありますけども、その狙いの違いがどこにあるのかっていうのと、どちらの方のセットが好きなのかっていうの。
You play, sometimes you play an acoustic set and an electric set. デザインって言いました。
いやいや、
違い。
狙いの違い。
狙いの違い。Are you trying to do different things in each set, and which do you prefer?
Well, that's a good question. We no longer really do the acoustic and the electric in the same evening because ultimately it just didn't work out logistically very well. We love both of them. It's different things. It's like apples and oranges. And I think that for myself, as much as I enjoy playing electric music, because electric music is very seductive, I think my first love is acoustic music. But that said, because we've just done some long electric tours, as soon as you pick up that electric guitar, it's you get that feeling of power.
You also had the metal Hot Tuna years too.
I have no idea what you're talking about. Yes, we did. Yes.
以前そういうふうにやっていたけれども、どっちも好きです。比較できません。リンゴとオレンジを比較するようなものなんだけど、両方やるとね、how do you say logistically in Japanese?
どう言って言うんだろう
まあ、
ね。言葉で機材なんか大変
い
なんです。
ろいろとこうアンプのことだ、多分機材的なことだと思うんです、基本的には。いろいろとちょっと面倒なことがあったから、最近は両方はやってません。エレクトリックでやる時もあるし、でも、なんだかんだ言いながら、やっぱりアクースティックミュージックは一番好きかな。だけど、エレクトリックギターを持つと、なんかパワーが感じられると、これもまたね、捨てられないもんだから。つい最近もね、エレクトリックツアーをやってたし、でも、どっちかをやるようになったっていうことですね。
Okay, questions? I'll give you the mic.
Yeah, same kind of a question as the previous one, that Jefferson Airplane is kind of more than successful. And you started with acoustic, but meanwhile you tried to perform in electric. But now you get back on acoustic. What was the driving force to come back to acoustic?
That's a good question too, and I think the answer for me, Jack can speak for himself on this, is identity crisis. I just never can figure out who I am, and professionally speaking, that was a problem for the record companies. We do acoustic, we do electric. They could never really label us. But the answer really is that we like both of them. And these days, if we're going to book an electric tour, it requires more money because we have to carry all kinds of stuff in the stage, bring a trailer and all that nonsense. Whereas if we're playing acoustic, here we are.
I got it. そのアクースティックに戻るのは、自分が自分のミュージシャンとしてのアイデンティティで時々迷うことがあったり、レコード会社の方でも時々エレクトリックやったり、時々アクースティックやったりするから、どういうふうに売ればいいのかわからないということもあったんでしょうけど、ツアーの費用っていうと、エレクトリックであると機材もちろんすごく増えるし、大きなトラックも必要になってくるんだけど、アクースティックだったらもうこれだけでいいから、費用はそんなかからずに自由に活動できるっていうのが大きい。
You know, there's an intimate quality with the acoustic music too, that I think we draw the audience into the real finesse work within the structure of the songs, so that you really become part of it, like chamber music. There's something different than that than a full orchestra. You do different things with a full orchestra than you do with chamber music. And they will take you, I think, emotionally to different places. And that's why we're so schizophrenic about it. We can do the acoustic for a long time, and then you get that drummer and electric guitars in your hand, and all of a sudden you're dealing with a different sonic quality, and there are different emotions that will come out within that structure. But I think for the longevity of our career, and also particularly Yorma and us and me with songwriting, there's something special and unique about what we've crafted after all of these years in the acoustic world that just gets better as time goes on.
あとアクースティックでやるとね、親密な感じがあって、お客さんをこう引き込むことができますね。クラシックに置き換えて言うと、管弦楽団と室内楽の違いのようなものがあって、その音楽から出てくる感情の質も違うし、時々ドラマとかエレクトリックギター使ってそういうのもまた楽しいけれど、長年こういうふうにアクースティックでやってると、なんていうんだろう、一つの自分たちの世界を観客とこう共有できるようになってきたり、そのような話をしてました。
Any questions? Other ones?
Go on right here, George. You got somebody at the back? じゃあそちら先。
最近の若手のミュージシャンで、お気に入りのミュージシャンとかおられますか？
Any recent musicians that you have who are like favorites, people who you think are good?
I've been listening to a lot of Celtic music lately, and There's a guy, a guitar player named John Doyle that I like very much. There's a singer-songwriter named Kareem Polworth that I've been listening to a lot lately. And a lot of people's names I don't really know because sometimes you pick them up in weird places on the internet or something like that, you know, on Pandora. But strangely enough, I've been listening to lots of Celtic music lately.
最近ケルトの音楽をよく聴いてる。で、特に好きなのがギタリストでいうとジョン・ドイル。あと女性の歌手でカリン・ポールワットという人がいます。その2人かなり気に入っています。いろんなところでね、たまたまインターネットで聴いたりとかそういうこともあるんですけど、ケルトの音楽を最近よく聴いてる。これはゆうちゃん。
Well, lately I've been listening to this French composer named Daniel Maison, and he builds together a lot of different world influences in the music, and he's got a jazz background, but yet he plays guitar and piano and keyboard, but he's able to mix different genres from a singer from Nepal, say, with doing a part of a jazz influenced track, and the combination of those are really something that I think that is what's really going on in a lot of the world music. Is the internet allows you to listen to so many different kinds of music that you normally would not find in your own culture. And I think the younger musicians that come along up with that have a broader palette to choose from and different influences, and then new music comes out of that. It would be inconceivable before, and I think that's really exciting stuff. So I like to go on the internet and get compilations of maybe 30 or 40 different tracks from all over the world, and just put it in my iPhone and go running or biking, you know, and listen to some of this, and just absorb it for its own sake without any prejudgment, you know, because you can funnel yourself into certain areas sometime, and I like to try to shape my musical sensibilities up that way.
Daniel, what's his name?
Maison, M-A-S-S-O-N.
M-A-S-S-O-N.
Yeah, it's a French composer.
ダニエル・マソンっていう、フランス人の作曲家がいます。ちょっとジャズっぽいグループ持ってて、彼はギターとキーボードをやるんですけど、例えばネパール人のボーカリストがいたり、そういう世界のいろんな要素を一つの自分の音楽に盛り込むようなことをやってて、ある意味これがこのインターネットの時代を象徴している音楽かもしれないって言って、かつてありえなかったほど今インターネットでいろんなところの音楽を簡単に聴くことができます。で今の若いミュージシャンたちはもう最初からそういう環境になってますからね。で影響の受け方も変わってくる。そうするとね、一つのジャンルじゃなくていろんなジャンルがこう混ざるような、そういうことがよくある。で最近はインターネットからいろんな、国の、音楽を一つ一つこう、ダウンロードして、それを一種のコンピレーションみたいにして iPhone に入れて、走りながらとか自転車で漕ぎながらとかね、そういうふうによく聞く。下手するとね、自分がこう固まっちゃって一つのジャンルだけ、聞くようなことになりがちなんだけど、できるだけそういうふうにならないで、自分を解放して幅広く聞くようにしています。
90年代の終わりぐらいにヨーマさんがスティーブ・キモックとビリー・レッシュのバンドに参加してそれライバルになってると思うんですけども、ヨーマさんから見たビル・レッシュとそれからジャックさんの違いというかヨーマさんのどういうふうなお二人に対して感情を持っているかとか、あと同じベーシストとしてジャックさんがビル・レッシュに対する思いどういうふうな感じに思っているか。
In the late 90s, you played in a band with Steve Kimmick and Phil Lesh.
Yes.
He'd like to know what differences you perceive playing with Phil and playing with Jack. And also he'd like to ask Jack just how you feel about Phil Lesh as a musician.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question too. We're talking about two completely different bass players here. Phil's approach is very different. I cut an album with Phil that I recorded live at the Warfield Theater, and we rehearsed. It was a great band. Steve Kimmick, one of the world's great living guitar players. Pete Sears keyboards. we really rehearsed a lot for that. And even though Phil leaves room for jamming, that was one of the less jamming bands that I played in, because some of those Grateful Dead songs are so complicated, you know. So it was really interesting. But Phil is not what I would call a groove bass player, whereas Jack is, even when he's playing melodic things. It's a really different kind of a thing. And for me, it was a really interesting experience because it was so different from anything I'd been used to.
フィルとやったのはウォーフィールド劇場というところのライブ版を作ったんですけど、とても素晴らしいバンド、スティーブ・キモコ優れたギタリストだし、ピート・シアーズキーボードを弾いてたんですけど、すごくリハーサルを重ねました。グレイフル・デッドっていうとすごくこうジャンプバンド的なイメージがあるんですけど、フィルはむしろあのバンドは自分がこれまでやった中でジャンプの要素が割と少なかったものです。とにかくグレイフル・デッドの曲はとても複雑なものが多いですからね。でフィルっていうのはあまりグルーブのプレイヤーではない。ジャックはすごくメロディックなベースを弾いててもいつもすごくグルーブの強いベーシストなんですけど、フィルは違うタイプです。どっちがいい悪いということではなくてタイプが違う。
When we started out in San Francisco and I first heard Phil actually play, I thought he had the most unique approach to the bass that I had ever heard. And later on, after we became pals and we talked and we go to each other's shows, his style of using a pick in a percussive manner, but also in downstrokes and upstrokes, gave him an interesting rhythmic approach as well as a melodic approach to the bass. And as the Bill Kreutzmann and then later on Mickey Hart came into the band in the rhythm section, I watched them develop through that period of time, coming up with some such unique approaches to the songs, an approach that I wouldn't have at all. But I played with my two fingers, so a lot of your approach comes through your technique as a pathway through to how you hear your music and as you develop your technique. And Phil's approach later on, I understood that he came up somewhat through the classical world. He had interest in John Cage and electronic music of the early 60s, late 50s, early 60s. But also he played trumpet. And when I realized he played trumpet, then I thought, I started hearing that approach, that single note approach through a linear part of the song. And I began to understand how he heard the music. And to this day, he's still got there's nobody that plays like him approach to the music as he carries on a lot of that direction with his current bands.
もうフィル最初に聞いた時から本当にこの人独自のサウンドを持っていると思ってて、いまだにそう思ってるけれど、ピックを使いますね。でしかもダウンストロークもアップストロークも両方使いますけど、すごくこうリズム感の強いリズミックな弾き方をする人です。ジャックはこう2本の指を使うとやっぱりそこでまた変わってきますね。またフィルは現代音楽の世界から出てきた人なんですけど、トランペットも吹きます。でトランペットっていうのは単音の楽器なんですね。で彼がトランペットをやるってことを知ってから、なるほどそれでこういうベースの弾き方になるのかって、そのベースラインの組み方とかね、そういったこともそういう影響も受けていると思います。とにかくね、今はもう全くユニークなベーシストだと思っている。
ありがとうございました。
One or two more?
じゃあ
そう一つか二つ。
どうだったら
どうぞ。
他に
2人いましたね。2人にしましょう。
じゃあ2人、はい。じゃあどうぞ先に。はい。
ダグラスさんのフェイスブックのサイトでリクエストを募集したんですけども、エンブリオファニックジャーニーのリクエストが多かったんですけども、今日3回目なんですけど、今日はやっていただけないかなという。
It's not a question, it's a request. On the Down's website, he's accepting requests, and he's requested Embryonic Journey. It hasn't been played yet, and this is his third time to see you guys, so he very much hopes you're going to play it. 156 seconds.
私はジャーサン・プレーンが世界中で一番好きなこれは本当なんですけれども、それでですね、さっきのパパ・ジョン・クリッチが出てきた時にヨーマさんのギターの音色がすごい似てるような気がしたんですよ。でひょっとしたらヨーマさんが望んでいた音に近いんじゃないかと思って最初にパパ・ジョンのバラに聞かれた時になんか驚いたんじゃないかと私は思ったんですけど、その辺はどうなんでしょうか。
When Papa John Creech joined the group, he felt that your guitar sound was very close to his sound. And he thought maybe his sound on the violin was kind of the sound that you'd been looking for.
Well, once again, we were never guilty of overthinking the process of wherever the art went, but my guitar sound with the Jefferson Airplane evolved from a number of things. One of the things was that I'd never really played electric guitar before I got in the band, so I just had to figure out what to do. The other thing was that Paul Cantor, the rhythm guitar player, played a 12-string guitar that takes up a lot of space, so that the sound that I used that worked well with the Airplane was very, very high-end. It's not a sound that I would look for today in what we do with Hot Tuna and whatnot. And so I think coincidentally, maybe one of the things that made Papa John fit in so well, aside from the way that he thought, because he had no preconceptions. He would play rock and roll, great, what a great idea. I mean, he was really pretty much up for anything. But that upper register of the violin, I have no doubt, was very similar to the guitar, and as a result of which, it was you could not deny it had to be heard.
それほどね、意識して考えてたわけではないけれど、エアプレインではポール・キャントナーは12弦ギター使ってたんですね。で12弦っていうのは結構ね、なんていうの、音域的に場所を取るっていうか広がりますよね。そうするとヨーマのスタイルはうまくそのサウンド全体の中で、自分の、存在を感じさせるためには高い音を使うことが多かったんです。でそうするとパパ・ジョンも彼もね多分そんなに意識してはいなかったと思う。すごく柔軟性のあるミュージシャンで何でもやる人だったけれど、その高い方の音域を使ってたことが一つの特徴だったし、だから同じように感じられるんじゃないかなと言ってました。
Okay, I guess we're about ready for a live gig.
Yeah, we said 80 minutes is probably going to be too long for the talk. We've gone over that, so it's about time to shut up now. We'll have a short break and you guys can play some music for us. Looking forward to that. Okay. Yep.
10分ぐらい。
10分ぐらい休憩しますので、それからまた出てきて、ライブやります。